Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Ask Zajef Baizhu, I believe, #1. So this is, as far as I'm aware, Baizhu's first rerun. So there's a bunch of stuff to talk about. On top of that, he is being rerun right at the same time as Furina was released, and Furina does a lot to change Baizhu's value. So let's get right into it with question #1. What is his overall place on the meta, pull value, especially compared to the other 4.25 stars? How much has changed with him since his initial release in 3.6? Can you shut up? How impactful has Furina's release been to his value? So we can kind of start with the last question because I think it's the easiest way to lead into it. Furina's release has changed a lot. Baizhu has always been a character that was like defensive focused Dendro application, and unfortunately for, well, up until Furina's release, what he provided over Yao Yao was just not all that valuable. He did offer a bit of resistance to interruption through shields, and he also did offer a little bit of damage to your Dendro reactions. But a lot of Dendro teams ended up being played in situations where the on-field character is not the one triggering the damaging reactions. For example, a lot of the Hyperloom teams, you're not on-fielding the Electro character, and his buff only applies to the on-field character. You can apply it to an on-field character and then swap out, and then they still have it for a little bit, but it's not that long, so most of the time it kind of just doesn't do much. And that leads to situations where he just doesn't do that much for your teams that Yao Yao can't do. However, with Furina's release, a healer can't just have healing when you need it, because you need it every rotation, right? With Furina, you need to restore the health that you're draining from Furina's skill. Otherwise, Furina's dog shit. That means that you have to heal, like full heal your team every rotation, and it makes it so characters like Yao Yao that need field time to heal, it's not just, oh well, I'll need field time but only if I f up anymore. Now it's, I'll need field time on Yao Yao on every single rotation. Does that mean Yao Yao's bad with Furina? No, because some teams can't afford the field time, but it does create more opportunities for Baizhu to be good, because you do need to full heal every rotation, and Yao Yao doesn't do that with her skill only, right? She needs the burst, and she needs to spend field time when she does, whereas Baizhu doesn't. So the release of Furina has created a lot of teams where Baizhu is a fairly reasonably good option and does actually do some things over Yao Yao. Now, does that mean he's like omega insane while broken? No. There are some quite good Furina teams, but she's not a like incredibly insanely warping character that just makes it so that you want to try to fit her in every team. For certain characters, which we're going to get into later, she does a lot, and some of those characters would like to be played with Baizhu, so it's pretty impactful for him in those situations. But in a lot of other teams, she's a side grade or even a downgrade to other options. And so if those are the teams that you end up playing, then Baizhu doesn't gain as much value as he does in the teams where Furina's very good. But where does that put him for like his overall place on the meta? I'd say Baizhu is like, I'd say pre-Furina, he was kind of just like a whatever unit that you only pull for if you just really like him. Now, I'd say he's a bit more than that. I mean, you also, just like any other character, you can always pull them if you really like them, right? But like from a meta perspective, I think there is a bit more of an incentive to pull for him if you're playing teams that really benefit from being used with him and Furina. So I'd say that the biggest two examples are Sino and Alhaitham, and to some extent Alhaitham more than Sino, because with Sino, because he's a character that can't swap out, right? Like as soon as he swaps out he loses his stuff, whereas Alhaitham has options to have rotations where he can swap more, and because his animations are somewhat long and like you have to use his ES at specific moments if you want to generate enough energy and get your damage from your Ascension passives, then he tends to benefit a little bit more from having even more defensive utility, and I tend to not like Furina with him against aggressive enemies like the Coplea boss, but he's definitely, like, this is definitely a very strong option for him. But I think there are more situations where you might want to consider running a more defensive focused Hydra unit over Furina. But yeah, and then on the other side with Alhaitham, I think that it's a lot easier to not need that. And I actually have quite liked Alhaitham teams with Alhaitham, Baizhu, Furina, and then either Kuki or Raida. Now, there is a pretty big caveat to that, which is that the main reason why Baizhu is a good option in those teams, maybe more for the Alhaitham team than the Sino team, but at least for the Alhaitham team, the main reason why he's a good option for those teams is because Kuki just doesn't heal enough to really offset Furina's HP drain, which means that she can't be your healer, or at least your only healer. If they release an electro healer that does heal enough and that can proc Hyper Bloom, then I think it's very likely that you'd rather play them plus Nahida over like Kuki / Raiden plus Baizhu. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you want to like think about how future-proof he can be. It is very possible to shift him out of that team. Not that the team would become bad, but that you could have a better option. That being said, as far as I'm aware at least, there's no leaks for any electro healers anytime soon, so worth knowing that it's a possibility, but maybe not the biggest worry that you should have. I think that his pull value is actually fairly high if you end up playing him in the teams where he's quite good. If you're someone who likes playing Alhaitham and you have Furina, a character like Baizhu would be pretty good. Sino, when you have Furina, a character like Baizhu would be pretty good. Even if you don't have Furina, Baizhu is still a fairly good character with Sino. Grizzlies, right, who was released recently, has some teams with Baizhu that are quite nice. But he's not the kind of character that you'll pull because they're good to have on every account. He's the kind of character that are good for specific carries. So if you're considering going for him purely for meta, then it's just a question of, do you have those carries? Do you use those carries? Anyways, obviously there's also some other teams, right? If you can play him in Quicken teams with EI, with Kutsing. I do think that his value in those teams is a lot lower because I think that Yao Yao is a lot closer in those teams. You can play him in Nilo teams, but I actually tend to think Yao Yao is better in Nilo teams than he is. But he does have a bunch of teams where he can be good. Let's move on. Considering that previously less desirable team-wide healers like Jean are now at the forefront of teams built around Furina, how does Baizhu stack up against the game's other healers in this role, such as his strengths and weaknesses relative to them? I think that specifically with Furina, Baizhu has something that some of the other team-wide healers like Jean don't really have, which is that he has team-wide healing, but he also has pretty potent single target healing. Now, when you use a character like Jean, you use your burst, wow, cool, you full heal your team, you swap to your carry, you start hitting. Jean's healing over time is pretty shit. Like, her healing over time is like barely enough to keep up with the drain from Furina. So your carry is gonna start getting low, and that can be dangerous. If your on-field character is low HP, and you don't have forms of like resistance or of damage reduction like with Singto or with Beto, then it's more likely you die. And that's something that Baizhu has, which is actually like sustained healing on top of his team-wide healing from his skill, right? His burst does have fairly potent sustained healing over time. That will make it a lot easier not to just die. Also, he's Dendro, and he can consolidate Dendro application. Even though his Dendro application isn't the best, it's also not completely terrible. And having a character that can consolidate an elemental application on top of the healing roll is very nice, right? Same reason why Jean tends to be pretty good, because she can consolidate the Animo VV. Baizhu can consolidate Dendro application. And he also has a bit of resistance to interruption from his burst. The shields that you get from the burst are incredibly small. Like, they're weaker than a crystallized shield. Talked about this a few times before, but like they're very, very bad. Talent level 10, theoretical 50k HP Baizhu, that doesn't really happen, but whatever, right? We can pretend. That would be a little bit under 900 shield. Point being, right? His shield goes up to like basically less than 1000, which is, well, in a lot of situations, not even enough to protect you from one hit from a Hilly Turtle. Now, that doesn't mean it's bad. It's just, it's not a big shield. What a small shield does is it makes it so that whenever you get attacked, you don't get staggered. If you get hit while you're shielded, you will not get staggered. You'll not get interrupted. Because he generates small shields over and over, that's a form of pseudo resistance to interruption, which is quite nice. A lot like Toma's shield, although it doesn't refresh as often as Toma's shield does, so it's not quite as good on that front, but he's not mainly a shielder, he's mainly a healer, so having that form of pseudo resistance to interruption on top of it is quite useful. But yeah, And when it comes to weaknesses, it can be very difficult to reach his ER requirements, especially in teams that have a dedicated on-fielder where you can't really swap out of them to do 2 E's on him per rotation. His ER requirements can get really, really high because right, his burst costs 80 and he doesn't have real ways of regenerating energy in his kit. He doesn't generate that many particles. If his burst costs like 40 or like 0 whatever, right, and he didn't actually have ER requirements, it would be a lot easier to make him work in solo Dendro teams. But it's mostly an issue of like, because building ER doesn't actually hurt his damage too much because his damage sucks anyways, then it just doesn't matter that much. Like, it would be easier to play the teams with high ER requirements, but they wouldn't really be stronger assuming you can meet the ER requirements, because if you didn't have to build ER, you'd build what, like HP, so you'd heal a little bit more, but like you're already full healing, so who cares? How good is Baizhu's Dendro application relative to the other non-Nahida options? It's fine. Like, it's not great, but it is off-field, which is nice. It's fairly similar to Dendro MC, maybe a little bit worse, which isn't bad. Although it is single target, right? So that does make it a decent amount worse, but still. All in all, it's just, it's fine. It's like okay-ish. Talent overview, E or Q first, and is it ever worth leveling his normals? Overall, right? The healing, like, we can basically ignore the shielding and the damage from his burst because they're kind of a joke. So it's really just about the healing, right? Same for the skill. Every time you burst proc, it does about 2/3 of your skill healing, and it procs a total of, how many times does it proc? Okay, 5 to 6 healing instances. Let's say 6, right? Now, 6 times 2/3 is 4, right? So the single target healing from the burst is the equivalent of 4 times the single target healing from your skill, but your skill heals your whole team, which means that if you get 6 procs of this, you get about as much healing from the burst as you do from one skill, except it's very likely that you end up over healing on the burst, right? Because you're healing only the active character, you can't heal off-field characters. So I would say that skill is a little bit more valuable to level, but honestly, it's just not that big of a deal. You can kind of just level them more or less interchangeably. Especially with Furina, then it matters a little bit more, and I definitely would level skill first, but yeah. Artifact set overview, when to use Deepwood, when to use any other artifact set such as Instructor, and is the upcoming 4.3 set looking any good for him at the moment? So, you use Deepwood if you don't have someone else on Deepwood. I think in most teams where he's good, you end up actually just putting him on Deepwood. It tends to be better to have him on Deepwood and a different Dendro character on a damage set than the different Dendro character on Deepwood and him on like a support set. The only situation where I think you really consider not going Deepwood is when you're playing him in Quicken as solo Dendro, because you're not getting any bloom reactions and he's the only source of Dendro damage. And in those teams, you can kind of just go whatever. You can go Instructor, you can go TOM, you can go Clam if you want, you can go the upcoming healing set, which we'll talk about in a second. But yeah. But yeah, and when it comes to the upcoming healing set, now, we've only had pretty vague leaks, so unfortunately I can't give you too much information on it. If it works like it says it does, which is very possible that it doesn't because it's kind of dumb, then it's pretty bad. Effectively, it records healing up to 30k. For 10 seconds. And after 10 seconds, it gives you flat damage equal to 3% of the healing recorded. So kind of like a Shenhe Icy Quill, but based on your healing, up to 10 times. But the thing is, if you fully cap it before 10 seconds, you don't get the effect instantly, you still have to wait. Which makes it not that great. It's not completely dog shit, right? If you're playing him in a team where you do a decent amount of, or you get a decent amount of crit buffs or damage percent buffs, then it's gonna do basically the equivalent of about 2 clam procs, like 2 capped out clam procs. But in Baizhu's case, because he does have a way to do some sustained healing, I think it's not even gonna be better than clam. We also don't know how it works in AoE, if like it works like Shenhe, where if you're hitting 5 enemies, you lose 5 stacks, and Clam does work in AoE, so I don't think it's looking too hot for him. I don't think the upcoming set is really made for him. It's really more for the characters like Shala and Mika, I think. Is it ever worth building him for damage that says in Quicken team? Kinda. His damage is never gonna be great, but when you're not playing a Furina team, right, when you're playing a whatever Quicken team, you kind of just heal more than enough, even if you're not building full healing. So you can do a damage focused build and still heal enough. especially if you have high talent levels. I don't think it's worth doing in any team where you use Furina though. Artifact stat overview, ER or HP sands, HP or healing bonus circlets. How much ER does he want in his teams, and is EM valuable on him at all, such as in Nilo Blooms, and does he want triple EM there? Okay, this is Zajef from a few days later, and I think I didn't explain myself very well for the artifact stats questions, because at the beginning I kind of forbore his passive scales off of his HP, and so I ended up answering the question over the course of like in a very fragmented manner, so I just wanted to do it again. But yeah, so ER or HP sands is really just a question of can you reach your ER requirements with HP sands? If yeah, then yeah, sure, go HP sands, but otherwise you want to go ER, and in a lot of situations you're gonna need to go ER. HP or healing bonus circlet, if you want to maximize his healing, you go healing bonus, but he doesn't really need to have his healing completely maxed out in order to heal more than enough. You can very easily break even in Furina teams and stuff like that without maximizing your healing. And then at that point, HP is just going to be slightly better because it gives you your Ascension passive that increases your team's reaction damage based on his HP. With that being said though, if you are someone who doesn't really want to use like weekly boss mats on leveling your support and stuff like that, and you keep his skill and burst at level 6, then it might be a little bit difficult to heal enough, and you could consider healing bonus. And just in general, like if you feel like you need more healing, you can always consider healing bonus. But in my opinion, you're not really gonna need to go healing bonus in most situations, and then at that point it's just better to go HP. That being said, obviously if you have Fav and you need to get that crit and you don't have enough crit rate in your substats, then crit rate circlet to get your Fav proc can be more valuable. How much ER does he want in his teams? It's gonna depend on the team, obviously. I've talked about that a decent amount, so anywhere between like 130 to 250, 280. It really does depend on which team you're using him in. And does he want triple EM in Nilo Bloom, and is EM valuable on him at all? Not really, because you don't really want to have your Dendro unit be the one to trigger your Blooms in a Nilo team. If that is what's happening, you're generally going to have your ceiling be a lot lower and your overall output be a lot worse. It's generally much better to have your Hydro units be the one to trigger the reactions, because Hydro onto Dendro doesn't consume as much Dendro. So if you're using Dendro as your aura, basically every single Hydro application is going to be a Bloom, and your Hydro application tends to happen a lot faster than your Dendro application. Generally, that's really what tends to happen. You have your Hydro units be the one to trigger the reactions, and then, well, if he's not triggering Bloom, then EM on him doesn't do anything. If you play him as like solo Dendro in a Nilo Bloom team, then sure, I guess, but like, don't do that. But yeah, so back to Zajef from a few days ago. Weapon overview, how good or cope is his best in slot weapon relative to his other catalyst option, and prototype Amber versus 5 Codex versus TDDS. So, Green Donut. You get the proc, right, for about 15 seconds, which is 6 procs, which is 27 energy, right? You can compare it to prototype Amber. Prototype Amber restores 18 energy. So it's 9 more energy, which translates in a high ER requirements team to 30-something% ER, and in a low ER requirements team, closer to like a little bit under 20%. So generally, somewhere between 15 and 35% ER, depending on specific ER requirements. Which is alright, but again, like I said earlier, if you can meet your ER requirements, getting this means that you get to build a bit more HP, I guess, and like that just doesn't matter. Because he's not a character that deals significant damage no matter how you build him, then he gains less value because you can only heal so much, right? At some point, you start full healing your whole team, and it doesn't matter if you heal more. What about the HP scaling on his A4? I mean, it's just not that big of a deal. Like, not needing to go ER Sands makes you gain 46.6% HP, which is 6-point-something K HP, which is like 12% to your Hyper Bloom and like 5% to this. But the multiplier is already so high for like Hyper Bloom, right? At 1000 EM, your multiplier is already at 6.3, which makes his signature saving you an ER Sands, assuming it does, 1.9% damage increase. Right, like keep in mind, this is not multiplicative. This is not multiplicative damage bonus. It's an additive damage bonus to the damage bonus you already have from your EM. It's not useless, but it is very minor. The whole thing is kind of useful, but the amount that you gain from getting HP Sands instead of ER Sands isn't that big of a deal. Proto Amber versus 5 Codex versus TDDS. I think there's basically no situations where you go TDDS. It's just do it at your own risk, basically. I don't think there's any team where I'd do it. I think it's really between Proto Ember and Fav, and then it's just a question of, can I get enough crit rate to proc my Fav reliably without needing a crit rate circlet or whatever? I tend to prefer Fav, but the strain it puts on your stat requirements can be a little rough because you do need a lot more crit. And because he doesn't have a lot of multi-hit stuff, then if you don't have like very high crit rate, it can be hard to get your Fav to actually proc. So Proto Ember is still very, very viable for him. It also does help with Furina to get more fanfare stacks earlier into your rotation. So there's also something to be said about that. Constellation overview. How good are each of his constellation as well as their value overall? How impactful are each of them to his playstyle and build? And is there any particularly devious or just funny stuff possible with his C2? His C1 helps alleviate his ER requirements because there's a lot of teams, like Sino teams, like to some extent Risley teams, where you just can't really get 2 E's per rotation without the C1. And getting the C1 means that you can just use 2 E's at once, right? And that helps his ER requirements quite a bit. Let's say basically it does a lot more than his signature in terms of helping his ER requirements. C2, when your own active character hits a nearby opponent with their attacks, Baizhu will unleash a Gossamer Sprite Splice. Gossamer Sprite Splice will initiate 1 attack before returning, dealing 250% of his attack as Dendro damage and healing for 20% of... It does 20% of your E healing. It happens once every 5 seconds. It's nice. It gives you some application without even having to swap into him. It does help his off-field application overall a decent amount. Gives you some application at the start of your setup before you swap into him. Overall, it's a pretty nice constellation. It's all right. It's an okay-ish one. Is there any funny stuff? Well, you can get Dendro out without even having to swap into a Dendro character, but that's really all there is to it. Burst level, kind of whatever. 15 seconds after burst, increase party's EM by 80. It's fine. This is a 4-star constellation, not a 5-star constellation. It's so weird to see it here. Increase skill by skill level. It's fine, whatever. And increase his damage on the burst based on his max HP. And when you hit the enemies with your E or with the C2, you generate another shield. So that just increases his app, right? I don't think I ever looked at his C6, I'm gonna be honest. So it increases his app and increases his damage. It's pretty good. I don't know if going all the way to C6 is worth it for something like this, but it is an alright constellation. Like it does make him better, it's nice. But yeah. If one intends to go either for his C1 or best in slot, C1. I'm not even reading the rest of the question. C1, 100%. Team overview. Which archetypes suit Baizhu the most? Can you briefly explain Bain-Marie along with her rotation demo? And how good is he as a general utility slot for teams that normally don't involve Dendro units? So let's start with the last question. How good is he as a general utility slot for teams that normally don't involve a Dendro unit? He's kind of whatever. He's fine, I guess. Which archetypes suit Baizhu the most? Any archetype where you need healing and Dendro? And can I briefly explain Bain-Marie? Sure. I'm not going to do an example rotation because I don't have Risley, but I can explain what's happening. So basically, when you trigger burning on an enemy, you get a Vaporize, but you don't get a Bloom, right? No Bloom Seed. Which means that if you have a straight up Burden team with pretty slow Hydro application, you'll get 4 Vapes on your Hydro unit, which is nice, but you won't get any Burdens, which is not nice. However, if you add a Cryo attack in the middle of this, then your Hydro attack will trigger both Bloom and Vaporize. What that means is that if you have a slow hitting Hydro unit, like Furina for example, it doesn't really work that well in a Burden team. Unless you're also including a way to weaken the Burning Aura to get some more Blooms. And when that way to weaken the Burning Aura is a Cryo unit, then not only is your Furina generating Blooms and vaping, but your Cryo unit is also reverse melting. So you're gaining the benefits of a bunch of different reactions all at once because of the ways that they interact with each other. It's not like an insane, wild, broken team, but it is a very viable team for Risley. And yeah, it's pretty okay business. Does he have any alternatives in Bain-Marie, and can the Cryo there also be different for that matter? Yeah, you can use Yao Yao, but it's not quite as good. You could use Nahida if you had a way to actually get some healing. I don't know if there's any real Cryo alternatives. I mean, you can use Ayaka, I guess, but playing Ayaka without freeze, her burst is not very fun. It's mostly a Risley team. How restrictive is Baizhu's relatively weak Dendro application for his comp, and is it ever an advantage? It's a slight advantage when it comes to quicken teams, because it means that it's easier to do your VV setups, but it's also not an advantage because it means he's doing less damage. And in all other situations, it's not really an advantage. He do some of his voice line in both English and Japanese. That does it for Ask Zajef Baizhu edition. I myself actually just got him on this banner. I didn't really care whether I got him or not. I wanted to get Charlotte C1, and of course I got Baizhu'd early. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned a thing or two. And I will... Oh wait, no, don't forget to do the thing. Do the YouTube thing. Did you know only one of you is not subscribed? I know who you are.